Så välkommen till vårat panelsamtal här i slutet av våran årskonferens med Genesis. Jag har med mig 4 stycken paneldeltagare här. Georgia Purdom från USA och Ola Hörscher från Stockholm här. Göran Schmidt bor ju på västkusten och Jonny Bergman från Jönköping ungefär. Så där fick ni lite geografi då. Det andra får ni ta från våra föreläsningar sedan tidigare. Men vi ska ha ett samtal här och få lite frågor från publiken, så välkommen att delta på detta. Så trevligt, we have had a wonderful day. Georgia, we have listened to you a few times and we will have some questions from the audience and then we will see how we mix this with English and Swedish and det blir nog bra, vi mixar lite svenska och engelska. Men har vi någon som vill börja med att ställa en första fråga här kanske till Georgia?
I have a complementary question to the last talk that Georgia had about the ark. There were different types of animals that Noah took to the ark, but some of the kinds were not just one pair, it was 7 or 7 pairs, depending how the interpretation. Doesn't that mean that Noah could have taken different types within the kind, and then it must have been even more easy to get speciation after the flood?
A comment, Georgia. Ola, the microphone.
So yes, for those that and again, we have to remember that God brought the animals to Noah, so assuming that God brought a lot of variety, which I think he probably would, from the 7 pairs or even 7 that were on the ark, it would definitely be easier to see the speciation because you start with more variety to begin with so you could see more speciation maybe even quicker after the flood. Yes.
Fler frågor, känner fria att ösa på, eller också alla trötta i skallen så det är helt kanske är helt tomt nu. Varsågod.
Yeah, what do you think is the best argument the evolutionists have?
You want me to answer that? Okay. The best argument, when people ask me that, I often say I don't really think they have any good ones, at least not as far as my area of genetics. I think the more that we study that and the more we understand just how complex DNA is and how complex organisms are, I just don't think they have any good arguments to support that for how that could come into existence, because their mechanism truly is random chance. So I don't really think there are any good arguments from the evolutionists when it comes to genetics, at least.
Feel free if you want to comment something. Or
yes, evolutionists would say that complexity as such is a bad argument because things may be complex without being created or a result of intelligent design. But it's the kind of complexity that is interesting. What they call sometimes specified complexity or irreducible complexity. The kinds of complexity is not just a mess, but it's order in complexity. And that is something which is a sign of an intelligent design, and so it's important to just underline that there is a difference between just complexity and the kind of complexity we find in nature.
Yes, if we sort of broaden the question, where are the best sort of naturalistic arguments for science as a whole, not only evolution and explaining the diversity of life, then I would say where there is perhaps most work to be done by creationist science is cosmology and origin of the universe. We know that the Big Bang theory has lots of gaps, and even scientifically, and there are some very interesting young Earth cosmologists, but it's still more work needs to be done there, and then some interesting work is being done.
But I guess that for the evolutionists, if you say that about cosmology, they also have the biggest gaps in cosmology, so they have not so much to.
Yes. So they have like concepts like dark matter and dark energy, which is infused into the theory because they cannot explain data otherwise. So. And
like the Big Bang, it's very speculative in many parts. I don't know, but that's what I have come across. Yes, fler frågor, varsågoda. Här borta har vi micken.
Ja, jag funderar lite grann på det här med kontinentaldrift. Har kontinenterna suttit ihop en gång i tiden, och i så fall flyttar de isär så att säga på grund av syndafloden, eller finns det någon bra förklaring där?
Continental drift. Have there been one big continent? Have the continents drifted, been apart, been together? Mm-hmm. The flood. What?
Right. So before the flood, it appears from Scripture that there was just one land mass, and then as a result of the flood, that these continents formed. And so, is that kind of what the question is then, or?
Yeah. How do you explain the continents and continental drift?
So a lot of that we would say that plate tectonics, and one of the models that creationists have developed is catastrophic plate tectonics. So the idea that as a result of the flood, these continents formed and broke apart and moved very, very quickly because it was a very unique situation with a global flood. It's not like we have today, which is fairly calm, and things, the continents are still drifting apart from each other, but very, very slowly because the mechanisms aren't in place anymore that were at the time of the flood.
So the big difference is most time perspective. Yes.
Right. Yes, you have the great deeps bursting forth. You've got a lot of volcanic activity, a lot of things that are causing these. It covered the entire world with water. So very different things were in play at that time and working that are not the same today. So it's just moving much more slowly today.
What can be seen is that there has been a lot of continental uplift, as a mountain build-up, when the sediments still have been soft. We can see it on the structure of the layers that they have been uplifted, and while they still were soft after the flood. Because if the sediments had been cemented and hard, they would have been broken in many places, but they still have been soft when the mountain ranges were uplifted. So, which also points in the direction that the Earth before the flood didn't have so many high mountains like today. The differences between the valleys and the tops of the mountains were well, perhaps there were only hundreds of meters that were being covered by water, and then after the flood there was a vast uplift. So that's how Bible-believing geologists.
Visst är det så att många eller kanske alla av de höga bergskedjorna har väl sedimentärt berg som innehåller fossil, va?
Yes.
Many or maybe all of the high mountains, they have sedimentary rocks that contains fossils and.
Correct. So things like when people sometimes have a hard time imagining, well, how could the water cover something like Mount Everest? Because the water would be so high, Noah couldn't even breathe, on the ark. But Mount Everest was formed as a result of the flood. So whatever the hills or the mountains were before the flood, they were probably a lot lower than the ones that we see today. So things like in the United States, we have the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains. Those were formed as a result of the flood. So they were not even in existence until that time. So that it was much easier then for the water to cover everything.
Följdfrågor är ju acceptabla också, va? Men annars så har vi vidare här kanske Henrik är fram här. Ulf är sugen på en fråga.
Ja, jag förstår att den här kontinentaldriften måste vara en mardröm för en lantmätare. Men jag tänkte så här också att under Pelegs tid så fördelades ju jorden, och då är det frågan om det skedde någon kontinentaldrift då eller om det var bara en uppdelning mellan folken.
Så Peleg?
Under Pelegs tid så delades jorden.
The Bible says that during is it called Peleg in English, that the world was split up during Peleg. Do you think that means about the continents or just about the people groups?
So I do think that when it talks about Peleg, I'm assuming that's who you're talking about. So that was the division of the people groups, not the division of the continents. And the reason for that is because the continents dividing, that's a very catastrophic event. And so if that would have happened, if that was referring to that would seem to be happening when there was already a lot of people, and that would have been very deadly to a lot of people if those kinds of events were happening at that time. So I think that most scholars put that as being the division of the people groups as a result of the Tower of Babel and not the continents, because that happened at the time of the flood, which was earlier than that.
Det står om i någon av släkttavlorna, va? Peleg är barn till någon, och så står det att det var under hans tid som jorden delades eller världen delades, eller det står. Ulf får en till här då.
Ja, en till fråga. Jo, DNA består av 4 kvälling, har jag förstått. Och jag har förstått att de kvävebaserna organisering skiljer minst 1%, kanske 20% mellan människa och schimpans. Och jag har förstått att 3 baser i sänder kodar för en aminosyra. Och om vi då har några 100 kvävebaser och var tredje är skadad eller ändrad i förhållande mellan människa och schimpans, då stämmer ju ingenting. Och då, om man då säger att det skiljer några procent mellan människa och schimpans, är det då antalet kvävebaser eller är det antalet aminosyror som de kodar för som man räknar?
Ni hjälper mig att översätta about the difference between chimps and humans.
Yeah, I think the question is in terms of genetic differences between chimps and humans. Do we mainly count it on the nucleotide level, or in groups of 3 like codons, coding for amino acids? And if there are many such changes on the nucleotide level, and that leads to differences of amino acids, how could that? You said that there are so many differences, so that sort of would not lead to. So the differences are too large, so to speak. So may I just start with getting one kind of response? I think there is a difference between coding DNA and non-coding DNA. So I guess within coding different DNA, there is a much more similarity because then we need to keep the amino acids in order to produce proteins. But in non-coding DNA, there could be larger differences. But could you carry on?
Yes, I would agree with that. So if you look at the genes, so the coding DNA that he's talking about, that codes that obviously for the amino acids, it's quite similar between humans and chimps. But the same would be true for dogs and other mammals as well. The genes are going to be similar because again, we come from a common designer God, and so our bodies have to do similar things. But there's obviously going to have to be a lot of differences in the regulation of those particular genes that leads to very different outcomes, just even in how we look and how our bodies function. And so a lot of that is probably going to be in the non-coding DNA, which there have been studies that have been done that look at that show it is significantly different between humans and chimps and other animals. That part really seems to vary more. And so that's because that's where a lot of probably the regulation is occurring, and it is different between the work. That's where I think that's where I personally believe a lot of the differences are. It's more in the regulation of it in that non-coding DNA versus in the coding DNA.
Yes, I understand, but the point of my question was it on the basis, nitrogen basis, it differed some percent, or was it in the three groups of coding nitrogen bases?
So it's not looking at it on the basis of coding versus non-coding DNA. It's looking at it on the basis of alignment, aligned region. So if the regions are similar enough, the computer will align them and say these regions are very similar, regardless of whether that's coding or non-coding DNA. So I don't really know. I don't have a lot of the studies that have been done by evolutionists. They will specifically sometimes look at the genes and say certain figures. But in the study that Dr. Tompkins did, he was mainly looking at just the aligned regions, which is irrelevant whether it's coding or non-coding.
Fortsatt frågor?
Om man tittar på den fallna världen som vi har idag så finns det ju en mängd organismer som är rätt elaka, som skorpionen till exempel. Är det någon som har forskat på hur den skulle kunna ha fungerat innan syndafallet?
In the fallen world, we have a lot of evil creatures like scorpions that have a bad function today. Is there any research on what they could have been for functions for this before the fall?
So that's a great question. A lot of people want to know even things like venom in snakes. You know, what was the possible good function of that before the fall? And I think that's an area of research that people need to look at. But even today, we find that snake venom is good for treating certain things like Alzheimer's and cancer, and they do use it for some good things, even in a fallen world. So it would be that's an area that I think, like I say, I think we need more research to really understand what those things were used for. We know everything was originally very good, so it wasn't being used to hurt or harm with. So the question is what? And we just don't know for a lot of those things right now.
Följdfrågan tänker jag också handlar om hur stor skillnaden kan ha varit liksom före fallet och inte.
Yeah, exactly. And if you would get this question from somebody, do you think that the baleen whales were sorting plankton, that is phytoplankton from zooplankton, before they swallowed? I mean the death, the problem of death life and death in a biblical perspective. Alltså, ja, ni kanske hörde, men skillnaden mellan liv och död, dog djurplankton, åt flugsnapparen flugor före syndafallet, ja, lite den typen av. Ja.
Right. So certain things, like plants, obviously are not alive in a biblical sense. I mean, they're living things according to biology, but they don't have a soul, right? They don't have the breath of life in them like animals and people do. So them dying, and even I think like things like zooplankton and even phytoplankton, things like that, bacteria, most people would not put that in the same category as animals. And so those things could definitely be eaten, and it's not a problem. It's not death before the fall because it's a different type of organism.
From a more speculative thinking, how big could the difference have been in the original world? Could maybe there was no venom in snakes, and
so that's one one of the possibilities is that while it was God knew what was going to happen, and so to allow those organisms to be able to survive or deal with a fallen world, that was one of the ways that he designed for that. But it was in their DNA, but not expressed. So it was there, but it wasn't functional, it wasn't working until after the fall. And so different things became expressed as a result of that. So that is one possibility. Or that it was there, but it just had a different function and a different purpose. Even bacteria, we know, so for example, the bacteria Vibrio cholera, which causes cholera, which is obviously a very bad thing in human beings, but that same toxin that it produces, if it's in its watery environment where it's supposed to be, it actually breaks down the exoskeleton, and we need that. It's a part of the degradation, part of turnover in the oceans, and that's a good thing in water sources. But you put it in a human being, and it has a very bad function. So some of it could just be that it's in the wrong place, wrong time. It's not supposed to be there. Cholera is not supposed to exist within us. But if we contract it, it can cause a lot of problems. If it's in its normal environment, what it's doing is perfectly fine. So that could be part of it too.
Yeah, before I go on my question, I just wanted to make a few comments on these questions. First, I want to say, actually, there is no venom. That is a concept we make of things we don't like. There is like proteins that flushes through teeth of a snake, and that protein makes us die, and we call it venom. But actually, it's a protein, not a venom. So Eve was in the garden. She was not afraid of the snake. She spoke to it. They had a nice time. Maybe the snake's protein was nice to her and Adam. But then, as we have seen the results of the flood, for instance, with the diversity of all these animals, things mix up badly. And the scorpion sting might have been used by the scorpion for different issues, but it may not have had the spiked tail. We don't know that. It might have been that the spiked tail is a result of the speciation afterwards. So there is a lot of things people assume that we don't have to assume. We can assume that, but we don't have to. I just wanted to make that
that's interesting
comment. My question would be, we have been talking science all the time, and I'm not sure if a more personal level question is fine. You can just say no. But I would be interested, how come your path to this profession, your interest, how did that happen? How was your journey to become this researcher? And your personal faith that you express very loud and clearly, how was your journey to come to that decision? I would be curious about that, if you would not mind answering.
Sure. So I grew up in a Christian home and was just really taught by my parents to love the Lord and love His Word. And so I became a Christian at 8 and then really loved science and was planning and really loved teaching. So I always loved to teach science, teach people about science. And so I became more and more interested after I went through college and then went into graduate school. A lot of people were talking about the creation evolution debate. And what I realized was that even though I had grown up in a very Christian environment and went to a Christian college and all of those things, I didn't know how to defend my faith. I didn't know, I mean, I kind of knew what I believed, but I didn't really know why I believed it. And could I answer a lot of these questions that you all have this evening? I couldn't do that, 25 years ago. I didn't know that information. And so the Lord really, 1 Peter 3:15 was a verse I shared because it's very meaningful to me, because the Lord really impressed on my heart that I needed to know what I believed and why I believed it. I needed to give an answer because this is about the truthfulness of His Word. And so I really started to dig into, I know we've talked, people have talked about the intelligent design movement and things like Signature of the Cell, and that wasn't out when I was first reading, but Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box was one of the first books I read actually in this area. And it just fascinated me, like, wow, this is an argument for the existence of a creator. But for me, that didn't go far enough, because that just tells you there's an intelligent designer. It doesn't tell you who it is, or if he's not just your creator, but your redeemer. And so I started to really then look into biblical creation and reading pretty much every book I could get my hands on and trying to understand it better. And it made such an impact on my faith. I can believe what God's Word says. The science is consistent with that. It's not just, oh, this is what the Bible says. It's that it's a reasoned faith. And so I wanted to help other people know that too, because I thought, if I can grow up in this very Christian environment and not know these things, then I want to start teaching other people, and I want to share that with other people. And so I was teaching college at the time, and so I just kept praying that God would open the doors for me. And then I was introduced to the people at Answers in Genesis and started talking with them, and they were starting to hire PhD scientists at that time, and so they needed a biologist. And so I was very happy to accept that position. I've been there 16 years now. And so I still get to teach. I still get to tell. I never gave up teaching. I just do it in a different way and really get to help people understand that they have a reasoned faith, and that this is important, not only just to the authority and truthfulness of God's Word, but to the gospel itself, and to help others be able to do the same.
Frågor? Vi tar först här och sen får Johnny ta nästa.
Jag har en spännande fråga. En känslig fråga. Jag vet inte om man säger det på engelska. Sensitive question or something.
Det är nog bra.
Often we accuse evolutionists for storytelling. They invent things very often. But I feel and have felt very long that we also use storytelling in an area that we talked about rather newly. It's about scorpions and such things. How did it came to be those types of animals and plants and so on? I feel it's like a taboo question among creationists, but I have another view in that matter, because in the beginning of the Bible about the fall, it stands that you shall die if you do not. The Adam fall, but it was only man who should die. it stands nothing about the animals at all. So that do not exclude that animal actually died at the beginning, and it might not even be so that it is bad that animal dies. It could have been included in what God said it was all good. We have today, it's very common that humans make animals human-like. Well, you should treat animal good and so, and oh, it's so sad when the dog died, and well, do it come to heaven and so on. But they are still only animals. And how do God see to animals? Not how do we see to animals, how do God see to animals? It might be so that scorpions was there already at the beginning, but it could, of course, be, and I think it has been so, that animals has speciated, and there has been a variation that has been, it has been a change that is not good. But still, I think that the most part of those kind of animals, the bearded whales and so on, they were probably there at the beginning.
So how bad do we see?
How bad is bad and how good is good? Yeah. There must be different views among creationists in this question. I know that the overall common view is that there were no death among animals, but I don't think so personally.
What would you say? How bad is the thought about animal death in some levels and in some cases?
So, well, I would disagree with you. So I don't believe that animals killed each other or hurt each other or man before the fall, because after man sins, after Adam and Eve sinned, yes, he did give them the command that they would die if they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But then also everything that they have dominion over becomes affected as a result of that. So we know from Romans 8:22 that all creation groans. The ground has thorns and thistles. Animals were cursed. The serpent specifically was cursed, but it says, "Cursed are you above all animals." So that is basically then saying all the animals are cursed. All animals are affected and impacted as a result of this. And so I would not see how God could say, oh, this is, at the end of his creation, he called it very good. And you've got a scorpion over here stinging something and killing it. And you've got animals eating each other. Those are not very good things. Those are very bad things when we look at that. And even today, when we see, I remember when, even seeing a cat catch a mouse, that's not a very good thing. That's gross. We don't like that. We reject that, because this is not the way that it was originally created to be. Everything was originally created to be vegetarian, because in verses 29 and 30, God specifies to the animals and then to Adam and Eve that they're only to eat the green things. They're not to be eating each other. So I just don't see that there's any basis for animal death before the fall from a truly scriptural standpoint.
I think about Isaiah 65 and maybe also chapter 11, when it says that God will do away with all evil. Is that
So when we talk about the new creation, okay, when Jesus returns and sets up a new heaven and new earth, it talks about the lion laying down with the lamb, and the child will stick his hand in a viper's nest and will not be impacted by it. So it's going to be a restoration of things as to how they originally were. It's going to go back to that, and it's going to be like that then forever. It can never be changed. So yes, that's another indication.
But of course, it's interesting that there is different levels of problematics from a creationist view, as we heard here. There is smaller problems and there are bigger problems.
I just want to remind you all that you can ask questions to everybody in all the persons in the panel, and you can come back and forth.
Vi kan få en kommentar till här, tänker jag ändå. Ta micken så hörs det i inspelningen.
I am fully aware of that land animals couldn't eat animals. They must eat vegetables. It's about land animals. The animals in the sea, it stands nothing about that. And then it's animals who, I don't know, I don't remember what it stands exactly, but those who breathe through the nostrils or something. Not scorpions, though. So there are different kinds of animals that we might interpret in different directions. So, okay, scorpions perhaps could kill different kinds of insects and so, but land animals did not. But but on the other hand, they might have had a
limited
lifetime.
Yes, so it's a question about where to put the line,
well,
like flies.
They might not have had eternal life, a dog. They might have died anyhow later on. It's not impossible, but they didn't kill each other.
Right, so with insects, there's always that sort of debate, as to what they are. At Answers in Genesis, we err on the side of them having the breath of life in them, and that not happening before the fall. But that's a debated question. Mm-hmm.
Vi hade Johnny skulle få ställa en fråga. Visst var det så vi sa?
Yes, I have a question. How common is it with female creationist scientists? Are you in a minority?
En gång till.
How common is it with female creationist scientists?
How common? How many are female?
Oh, how is it being a female
creationist
scientist?
And that there is not so many.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I think part of it is traditionally because just as a whole, there's not a lot of women at the higher, at least in the United States, there's not a lot of women at the higher levels in science that complete their doctoral degree and go on to then do research and study. That at least in my field, there aren't that many. And I think part of it is because it is hard for women that are married and having children at the time of their life that they're also trying to get their doctorate degree. So a lot of them will maybe get it, but then not work in the field because of taking care of a family. And so I think that's part of sometimes that's part of the, where women see it as it's hard to do all those things. So I have a very supportive husband, and so he helped me be able to complete my degree and, be able to teach and do those things and be successful at that. I think there's a lot of, I think it's changing because I talk to a lot of women that are young ladies that are wanting to follow in those footsteps. I think too, when you don't have any role models and don't have a lot of people to look up to that have done it, I think it's hard. So I think we're gaining some momentum in that area. But I think traditionally it's been more challenging because really back in the 60s and 70s, women typically weren't getting their PhDs and doing these things, but now they are. So it's just taking kind of time to, I think, catch up. Mm-hmm.
Vidare frågor?
I have two questions. Ola, you talked about science and creation. And what about, do you really think that we could see an opening for this, your last, shall we say, wish? That because now I think in many cases, a lot of people just say that science is, like evolution is science, and science cannot allow to have any outside agent inferring into science. How should we make it like this, open-minded?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the key issue how is philosophical. How do you define science? Do you allow for supernatural explanations and theories? And today, as I mentioned in my talk, today a principle is dominating methodological naturalism, that you only allow for natural explanations. Although the creationist arguments are getting stronger and stronger in geology, in genetics, in physics, in many areas. So I think it's a paradigm shift that needs to come about, that we remove that principle. But it's often very difficult to break paradigms, but I think there is a spiritual force behind this paradigm, because common descent, evolutionary theory is sort of the basis of a secular worldview. And there is also a spiritual dimension behind it, and that's the reason why it's so difficult to break, even though the data is getting more and more supportive of the creationist view. So I think it's a spiritual battle behind, really. But I think on an individual basis, lots of people will be convinced by the creationist arguments. But the question is whether the academic society as a whole will be. Well, that's another question. And, well, we live at the end of time, I think, as well. So if we bring that into this, maybe that will not be the case. We don't know.
I think it may be a risk that theistic evolution may be some kind of rescue for the materialistic view as science go further, and there are more and more arguments to doubt Darwinism. Then theistic evolution may be some kind of dilute religiosity that might be swallowed by almost everybody. Even Christians and atheists may swallow that bite somehow, and maybe that's the reason why theistic evolution is so promoted, and there is such strong lobbyism for Christians to accept evolution, because it's in an anti-Christian religion. Then theistic evolution might be exactly what is needed to keep the Christians satisfied, and it's also even atheists and agnostics may think it's okay. So that's a way of thinking that I have been doing for some time.
Maybe we got some of the answers already, but I wonder, I don't know if you all lecture in universities, but I wonder if it's allowed to mention these things when you teach the students, or even argue about it, or mention about it. Is it allowed? Is it okay?
So I think when it comes to the school world, I think it's possible to teach about creationism and intelligent design in classes of religion, but not in natural science. So that sort of reflects that, yes, this is like a philosophical idea. The underpinning is like, well, these are sort of theories that are, even though they claim to solve problems in natural science, they don't, but they are still allowed to be taught in philosophy and religion. But I think we should use that opportunity to really be, and also give scientific argument within philosophy and religion classes. But I think it's even more difficult in the academic world at universities. Then I think this secular view of science dominates a lot. It's very sensitive even to go half the way and talk about intelligent design. That's not either considered a science, because it breaks this rule of only allowing for natural explanations. And just going 1/4 of the way, saying that something is fine-tuned, things are sort of very detailed planned. Also, different constants of nature are finely calibrated. That is allowed in physics and has been for many years, but it's very sensitive to talk about fine-tuning in biology. And that's not even saying that it's a designer that is behind the fine-tuning. So it is very difficult to, within the academic world, to talk about a designer and even more about God, like as part of a as part of a scientific theory.
Can I just take a follow-up on this on natural methodology to Georgia? Like in America, many persons in your country believe in a creator and in a creationist view, but on the academic level, there is not so many. Is that right? Should you say that that's the God in academics? Is that their idol? Do you understand my...
Right. So I mean, people in academics, there are very few, I would say very few, at least I can speak for biology, that would be biblical creationists that are at that professor level, at that really high level. Is that what you're asking about? And then why there isn't?
Yeah, like is that their idol? Is that why there is so hard to accept different views?
I think, I agree, yes. So the idol is themselves. They want to worship themselves, and they are their own. They want to be their own God, and I think you even see it sadly, among many, even Christian professors that want to be. Well, they want to be Christian, but they want to be accepted by the intellectual community at large, and so they'll buy into things like I was saying about like theistic evolution and. Well, that's a little bit easier because people will still see me as, smart, intellectual, and accept it because I believe in evolution. And so I think it's very, very challenging because, as Olaf was saying, it's really about it's a heart issue. This is a spiritual battle that's going on. That really is the key to this. It's not about just what intellectually they can think through, but if there is an intelligent designer and it is the God of the Bible, then you're a sinner and you need salvation and you can't keep living the way that you're living. And people don't want that. They want to worship themselves. They want to continue in that. And so I think that makes it a real impediment, makes it very challenging.
Vi går vidare. Yes.
I have a question on this. I had thought of getting the answer to what actually life is. How it occurs, and I didn't get an answer today. So, no, I mean, this amazing question that we know so much, but we do not know what life actually is. As you showed that picture of the herrings in the basket, and saying, okay, everything is there, but we cannot bring it to life. So, isn't that a real problem for the secular scientists that they cannot actually bring an answer to that or getting close to that?
They are sure that life has arisen spontaneously, but still they don't know what it is. But they know it anyway.
Yeah, so I have a question from the live chat on YouTube here. DNA was only discovered in the 1950s. This puts focus on information. It gives the impression of a plan. What were the implications, or what are implications? Was there any preparations for this change of focus among evolutionists?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Take it again, Samuel. Translate it for us so we...
Yeah, I think the idea here is that there was a big radical shift in focus when they discovered DNA and realized that there's a lot of information processing in the cells. And so the question here is like, what are the implications? Was there any preparation for this change of focus among evolutionists?
Preparation, like were they prepared for what they were?
Yeah, I guess were they prepared for that, or how have they handled the radical shift coming with the discovery of DNA, I guess, if I try to interpret.
Well, when I went to school, then the DNA had some 10 years of its existence in science, and I never heard anything at school about information whatsoever. It was never anybody who spoke about it, They never even mentioned information. I heard information connected to DNA first from creationists and ID proponents. So I think that it was a matter that nobody really were talking so much about because it was difficult to handle. I think so. I think it's that there is an area of biology today called bioinformatics, and that people today are speaking out loudly about genetic information. I think it's much because of our that we have been talking about it for a while. It cannot be just dismissed any longer.
Yes, even when I was doing my PhD, which was the late 90s, they were just starting bioinformatics departments because now we were able to sequence the DNA. I mean, that technology had to develop, and that wasn't until we didn't finish the human genome until 2000, 2003. So to even be able to sequence things and have this information to be able to deal with it, it's recent. It's really not been around. We only known the structure of DNA since 1953. So a lot of this is very, very new in that sense.
So the person asking is qualifying here a little bit. Yes, did the discovery of DNA or information change the game, so to speak?
Yeah. I really agree with what you said. But I think when it was discovered, the structure of DNA in the 50s, that really has meant a lot for creationists and ID arguments, but in the long run, it took maybe a few decades to really develop those arguments. The ID movement was born in the United States in the late 80s, early 90s, and Michael Behe and others, they really used concepts like irreducible complexity based on information and things like that. But if we go a little bit earlier, when Darwin formulated his theory of evolution, there was still no mechanism for how the evolution happened. And just before the structure of DNA was discovered in the 50s, we had a modern synthesis in the 40s and early 50s that, yes, now we have found the mechanism of evolution. It's genetic, it's natural selection operating on mutations. But at that time, people thought that macroevolution was like microevolution. But through the discovery of the structure of the DNA and all the molecular biology revolution, it became clear that in order to explain the origin of new species or origin of completely new structures, there is so much that needs to be in place, so that through these discoveries and the molecular biology revolution, it was made clear after some decades that there is a huge difference between microevolution that creationists believe in and macroevolutions that has so far no support. So I think the discovery of DNA was the beginning of this process to realize that macro and micro are two different things, two completely different things.
And there's another aspect as well, and it's that in the 40s and 50s, scientists found out how to program. I mean, the computer technology just started out then, and people began to think about things in computer terms. And I think that without that perspective, I'm not sure that Watson and Crick would have cracked the code, but they did it because computer science had begun, that way of thinking about codes and such things had been something. If there weren't any codes in programming, then they maybe not would have found it at that stage, but there was some. So the awareness of how computer works was a key to understand how a DNA works, and that tendency has continued. That because we are developing our technology, we discover more and more aspects of living things, because now we can even see how God programmed different organisms when he put the same program code in DNA in different kinds of animals, because that's the way that skilled computer programmers do. They use the same modules of program code in different applications when they want them, and it seems like that was what God did. He did so as well. He wanted the bat to have kind of the same kind of system to ecolocalize as whales do, toothed whales, and so he put the same code there, and in some other animals as well. So, yeah, the correlation between computer science and genetics, that's interesting.
More questions?
Yes. If we continue to speculate about the world before the fall, do you think that mosquitoes and ticks ate fluids from plants, or what do you think?
The function of mosquitoes and such things before the fall. Did they mosquitoes?
That's always a favorite.
Did they eat something else, or?
So there are some mosquitoes even today that will use. They actually like prick plants, and there's a type of hemoglobin. Only it's not blood like we have, but that they can get out of plants that some of them use. So if you think about that, that's happening even today. Well, what if before the fall they all did that, you know? But as a result of the fall, some have started to do that, and not all mosquitoes require that either. So it's only some. So that's a possibility.
I have a question about genes, and I've read some papers, newspapers, and scientific newspaper that we have common ancestor, a female, so probably Eve. But then there's some other. I've seen some documentaries that we also they have that we have genes from many ape-like men from across the globe. How does that even match in? Is that even possible? Like ape man from Indonesia, an ape man from Africa, an ape man from other places, Neanderthals from Europe. Can they interbreed and have children that can procreate further? Wouldn't there be a stop there? Like for donkeys and horses, they get
infertile.
Yeah, they get infertile. They can't reprocreate. So, and these documentaries that I've seen on television, they say that we have genes from all of these kinds of prehistoric ancestrals.
You're saying that, okay, so I'm just trying to make sure I understand. So they're saying that you're saying that maybe you want to answer that one, or?
I can just say that the fact that we all have, it's the Nobel Prize winner Svante Pääbo lately, who discovered that we all have, well, all non-Africans have 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in our genes, which proves that at one time the Neanderthals were having babies with other ethnic groups, which proves that Neanderthal men and other people, they were as human as any other. And it's also the same with the Denisovan, the other type of people they used to call it. They were fully human, and they were also buried sometimes at the same localities. So it seems that the creationist perspective is really, proven to be right. It's not the first time. It has been a prediction from creationists for 50 years that the Neanderthal man was fully human, and that the nonsense DNA is really a myth. We have said that all the time, and now science is keeping up with.
Yes,
us.
and we see that all. I agree. You know, it's just when you see the papers, sometimes they're like, "Oh, look, Neanderthals buried their dead. Neanderthals made jewelry," and we're kind of like, "Of course they did, because they're fully human." You know, they're the ones that are finding it surprising, because they would say, "Oh no, Neanderthals aren't fully human. They're lower on the evolutionary chain, so to speak." But if you look at it from a fossil or archaeological perspective, but you also look at it from a DNA perspective, and like you talked about the Denisovans too, those are just variations within humankind. They're not different species. They're just different variations. As many audiences as I've looked at over the years, especially pronounced brow ridges, you can see that in some people even today, right? Some people have very pronounced brow ridges. I'm not calling them Neanderthals or anything, but they can have those traits sometimes. We still see that in the human population at large, but it's not anything fundamentally different. It's just some things were different than what we see in most modern humans today.
And in a creationist perspective, those people who were after the flood, they got separated out in small people groups, and then they got together, and one was Neanderthal man, and one was other.
Denisovans, yeah. There was probably some of these little, all these little people groups kind of all over the world, and they're intermarrying within those groups, and so certain traits just become more dominant, whatever traits they have, and so you have that. But eventually they think probably Neanderthals died out because of possible disease, or living where it was very cold. We don't know 100% why we don't see that as much today, but we just don't.
So they were separated and a little bit speciated, and then got together.
Don't say speciated. I don't like saying there's different humans.
But when a people group get isolated from a main population, and when it starts up with a few people, then there is inbreeding, and it affects the anatomy, and so may do that. And it may affect other aspects and health in different ways. And many small populations show signs of have gone through inbreeding in some stages, and so on. And some populations die out because it's their fertility drops due to inbreeding and such things. And some survive because they mate with other people's groups, and they get there, like going to a gene bank. It's kind of the same procedure, and the genetic material will be healthier, and so on. So I think many of those anatomic signs, the different people group may be just a mirror of their history. And they may be viewed as primitive traits, and so, but it has nothing to do with primitivity. It has to do just with the genetic material that happens to be there.
Would it be wrong to say that we have kept together our kind? If we see dogs, they have been very separated, but the humankind have kept together.
I guess, what do you mean by kept together?
That we don't have been speciated.
Oh, we don't have species. Yeah, and so the whole idea of what is a species really varies depending on even what organism you're talking about. So you, for example, bacteria, sometimes their DNA, if you look at it, can be very, very similar, but they'll even put them in different genre. So E. coli looks a lot like Shigella, but they're not even the same species or the same genus. Whereas you look at a coyote and a wolf, and they're different species, yet they look a lot alike. So it's a very human thing to name these species, but how we even define what a species is very challenging, and that's still a big question in biology. Is how do we define that?
The Bible and the science speak for one humankind, one human race, one human blood.
Now I'm speculating a little bit, but we know that the humankind was originated from one couple. So God put genetic diversity into Adam and Eve. But when it comes to all other kinds, we don't know for sure whether there was just one couple. That could have been God could have created a small population originally with even more diversity for a microevolution to work on further on, and hence make it easier for speciation to occur. But this is only a speculation, sort of. But that could be one possible reason why there. I mean, as you said, the humankind, we're still all humans, no different subspecies.
What is the clock?
I have one question. We have now this wonderful book by Stephen Meyer, Signature in the Cell, in Swedish. But he has written a rather new book, Stephen Meyer. I wonder if you have read it, where he has come to the conclusion that the God of the Bible is the intelligent designer. Have you ever had any comment on that, or is it the first step of the intelligent design movement, or what shall we think of that?
Did you understand the question? To all of you.
I saw that as well. I read the book. It was a bit too difficult to me because it was a lot of physics in it, but I saw his conclusion, and that was nice to see, I think, because intelligent design is it's a great strategy to use, I think, but it doesn't lead to the gospel. It doesn't have to do that, but I was happy when I saw it, that he had been more bold about his view. I don't think he's a young Earth creationist yet, but perhaps science will make him a young Earth creationist as well sooner or later. I hope so. Would be nice.
Okay, I have a question, and then I will specify a bit, and then I will repeat the question. What is supernatural? You mentioned that we have to exclude the supernatural because the naturalistic, materialistic science demands it in their approach, although maybe we should not require it. But now we have string theory, energy is matter, aliens came to Earth developing as octopussy, and if energy is matter, then why not beings that are energy and stuff like that? And then they say we cannot use the God anomaly because it's supernatural. But who defines what is to be supernatural? Because we could say that there might be species where the energy and the matter are intermixed in a way we haven't seen because we are not used to. When we fetch the instruments to measure, we will find them. And then we can say that's a God. Who defines what is to be called supernatural, and are the black matter and all this, are there creationist researchers among those areas of research? That's
So I think that's an excellent question. As a Christian, we think that in one sense all of creation is a miracle, so then in that sense everything should be supernatural, but we think that God has created universe and earth with certain laws of nature. So these are the rules of the games, but since he's a creator, he is able to make exceptions from his own created laws. And so I would say that God is behind everything, but when he makes exceptions from his own laws of nature, that is the supernatural.
Yeah, but I mean, like, when someone says that you say God created and therefore you bring supernatural into your so-called science or pseudoscience, depending on how you see it. But then you could say that if there were beings out of pure energy who has not materialized, because energy is matter, then that kind of being could be non-sensible by material objects, and we would have difficulties to actually see them. And if these things can be naturalistically called science in science papers, because they don't use the word God, they don't use the word creation, then that kind of species or being could have formalized something in their laboratory that became the first bacteria on Earth. And this would exclude any God, it would exclude any spiritual things. It would just be another way of saying there came an octopus from outer space, landed in our waters, and we see them as octopus. And that, published by the right person, would fall as naturalistic science. So my question, if I pinpoint it, of those naturalistic science associations, or what they are, who among them are the ones to define what is to be called supernatural and then excluded, and what is to be okay within the natural paradigm? That's my question. Who defines what is supernatural?
Yeah. And I would say, if something is natural, that's something that secular and Christian scientists agree with, but Christians say that God is behind the natural, whereas secular scientists say that this is simply natural process. No, God created laws of nature, but we also believe in God making exceptions from these laws of nature. But as you say, even secular theory could contain elements that seem to sort of also be like exceptions from the ordinary laws of nature. I would say that all of macroevolutionary theory is a big miracle, because we don't have any mechanisms for it. So that's a secular miracle, for instance. And you mentioned other things, maybe from quantum. Yeah, exactly.
Origin of life is also a greater miracle. You have to search for a greater miracle than that. It's against all the chemical laws, and still it's believed. Yep. Yeah. I think it's the majority, because it's no doubt that I mean, intelligence is needed for all complex or sophisticated structures, and humans and living beings are the most complicated of all. and so intelligence is needed. So it's just a matter of what kind of intelligence is allowed. Think about Ben Stein's film Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. I mean, it's so apparent that intelligence is needed for everything so it's just a matter of taste. If you like the idea of an intelligent God or not. It's if you don't like it, if you don't want it, then you will fight against that idea, and it's a decision that you take. I don't want to have an intelligent designer, but you can easily accept a materialistic intelligent designer like ETs. That's allowed. So it's a spiritual thing, a matter, really. If you want it or not, and it's no escape. You have taken a decision. That's my view of it.
Klockan är ju 9 och vi kanske, jag vet inte om vi är nöjda. Det går ju fortsatt länge. Vi har ju lite tid imorgon förmiddag också då vi också ska kunna ställa. Tomorrow morning we will also have time to ask some more questions. We have done this for a while now. It's interesting and there are still people in the audience. So I guess we could continue.
Still people sleeping in the room.
But it's interesting to have this opportunity to ask some questions, and I think all of us we like it a lot to have the possibility to ask. But maybe we are done for tonight and we can continue to speak a little bit here in the church instead. But thank you a lot for this possibility and to ask you things. We give them a hand. Så, man får fortsätta prata utan att vi är på scen. Så härligt.
Jag tänkte på det här som hon sa, om man nu säger så